Israel was formed in 1948 out of the British Mandate of Palestine, but this didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of 70 years of campaigning for Zionism by Jewish nationalists from all over Europe. There were several attempts to establish a Jewish state, but they weren't able to convince the great powers. Nonetheless, these early attempts of Zionism were still very interesting, and ultimately modern Israel was built on the foundation of these early movements. In the second half of the 19th century, multiple people came to the same conclusion, that the Jewish people needed their own state, or at least properly organize themselves. This desire was inspired and fueled by European nationalist movements and a new wave of anti-Semitism in many countries with a significant Jewish population. Most of the early Zionist movements were secular, and many also socialist. It was a fringe movement for a couple of decades, with its main advocates never even visiting Palestine. Some Jews did end up moving there. Most of them were from countries where they were legally, but especially socially, not emancipated, namely Russia and Romania. This came to be known as the First Aliyah. It was not a very big success. For every Jew that moved to Palestine, 40 moved to the USA. But in 1896, a new man joined the Zionist movement, Theodor Herzl, a Jewish man from Austria-Hungary that was still unaware there was already a movement that shared his ideas. In his book, Der Judenstaat, he argued for an independent Jewish state to combat anti-Semitism, instead of Jewish emancipation. He encouraged Jews to buy land in Palestine. The book was originally supposed to be a speech given to Baron Edmund de Rothschild, but he rejected a meeting with Herzl, fearing these plans would threaten Jews in the diaspora and the settlements that he was already financing in Palestine. So instead, Herzl published the book, which ended up being even more influential than what Baron de Rothschild could have done had he agreed to the plans. His book wasn't particularly original, but it helped get Zionism into the mainstream, and now many people that were unaware of the movement had heard of it. Herzl quickly rose to the forefront of the movement. In 1896, Herzl attempted to meet with the Sultan to present his plans, but he failed to set up a meeting. But through some connections, he was able to meet with the Grand Vizier, where he proposed the Jews would pay the Ottoman foreign debt in exchange for Palestine as the Jewish homeland. The Ottomans were not interested, but for some reason he did receive a Medal of Honor. His trip to Istanbul, although unsuccessful, did gain him the legitimacy in the eyes of other Zionists. In the following years, he organized the first Zionist Congress, where Jews from all over Europe came together to discuss realistic plans for Zionism and its future. He also founded the World Zionist Organization and even became acquainted with world leaders. Despite, or probably because of his anti-Semitism, the German Kaiser quite liked Herzl. You see, for the Kaiser, this was a practical way to get rid of the Jews, and he hoped that the Jewish people would be thankful for the Germans if he helped them. Not everyone was a fan of Herzl though. His hardest critics were fellow Zionists. Before Herzl, Jews in Europe were trying to legitimize Yiddish as a real language and not some ghetto dialect. Jewish nationalists were promoting it as a literary language, and theater was performed in Yiddish. And in Palestine, the Jews who did not just talk about Zionism but actually immigrated were promoting Hebrew as a common everyday language, and not just a religious language. There were schools that taught exclusively in Hebrew, there were Hebrew newspapers, and the first generation of native speakers was already born. And then comes Theodor Herzl, telling everyone that Yiddish is a ghetto language and Hebrew a language for religious scholars. Herzl wanted German to be the official language of the Jewish state. You would almost think he was a German nationalist that was rejected by German nationalists and became a Jewish nationalist instead. But that's a silly idea, of course. It's not like he joined a right-wing Burschenschaft and believed Jews in Vienna should convert to Catholicism to assimilate, or that he was an admirer of the nationalist German Kaiser until he was bullied out of his fraternity by anti-Semites or something. Anyways, Herzl was now a famous Zionist with connections and a pretty decent plan. His ideal plan was an independent Jewish state in Palestine or Argentina, but he knew this wasn't quite realistic and proposed a British or Ottoman protectorate in Palestine. In 1901, he finally met with Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Herzl presented his plans. The Jews would take on the Ottomans' foreign debt with the help of Germany in exchange for a charter allowing Jews to settle Palestine. Well, the Sultan liked Herzl, but he rejected any Zionist plans, and the two never met again. This is where I will change the course of history. What if the Sultan had agreed to the plans, and Herzl was able to set up a protectorate under the Ottoman Empire? How different would this Middle East be to our own? We know what Herzl had in mind for this piece of land, because he started writing a new book as soon as he returned home from his trip. A year later, in 1902, his book was published with the name Alt Neuland, the Old New Land in English, and was translated to Tel Aviv in Hebrew. It was a utopian novel about a Jewish state in Palestine. In the book, two men were tired of European decadence and went to live on a Pacific island. And on their way there, they make a stop in Palestine, which was an undeveloped, underpopulated land. They lived on the Pacific island for 20 years, and when they came back in 1923, they once again made a stop in Palestine. But to their surprise, this Palestine was a well-developed and thriving country. It's an industrialized and technologically advanced society. They visit a few Jewish cities and a Jewish university that is at the forefront of scientific research. But interestingly, Arabs have full equal rights, with even an Arab engineer in the government. In the book, a fanatical Zionist that claims the country is for Jews only runs for election, but is defeated. The common language of the Old New Land is Yiddish, but the academic language is German. And the culture is European in most ways, but minus the class system that was still important in Europe when the book was written. The capital is Jerusalem, but its largest and most important city is Haifa. The temple is rebuilt, but not in the place of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where the first temple was originally built. The Arabs in the Old New Land saw no reason to oppose Jewish settlers, because they developed the land and raised the standard of living. The book did not describe the map of the Old New Land in detail, but he named some cities that are part of the country. So I made a map based on that. At the time, Palestine was the name of a poorly defined region that was divided in two administrative zones in the Ottoman Empire. The Mutassafarat of Jerusalem and the Vilayet of Beirut. That is also why Herzl included cities in modern-day Lebanon. The cities of Damascus and Tadmor are mentioned as the cities along the railway to the Euphrates, which suggests they were also controlled by the government, but to what extent isn't explained. His book was clearly political and not just for entertainment. He illustrated the way the Jewish state could be founded and what the society should look like. Herzl already had these utopian ideas of what the Jewish state should look like at the time he met with the Sultan. So it's a great insight into how he would have tried to govern the Jewish state. It's announced in 1901 and the Sultan is in a good mood and agrees to Herzl's plans despite the inevitable backlash he will receive. Herzl sets up a charter company named the New Society for the Colonization of Palestine that takes on the Ottoman foreign debt plus an annual 25% tax of the profits the company makes, in return for the autonomous rights of the regions the Jewish settlements are located in. Officially, it would stay fully part of the Ottoman Empire, but in practice, it would become a protectorate. The Ottomans would also demand equal rights for the Muslims in the Jewish state, and a guarantee that they won't cooperate with the British, as had happened with Egypt. Ironically, it's the Germans who would be the biggest supporters of the new Jewish state. They would have strong ties due to the initial help by the Germans, but they would keep these ties because the Jewish settlers from Central and Eastern Europe spoke the Yiddish dialect of German, and because High German would have been the language of the state. The cultural war over the language of the Jews was being fought right around this time, and the Hebrew proponents were winning in our timeline. The 33,000 Jews that lived in Palestine around 1900 were studying Hebrew en masse, and with most of their children attending school in Hebrew and using it every day, the proponents of other languages for the Jews ultimately lost. Jews lived all over the world and spoke various languages, and Hebrew was already being used for religion, so it was simply the most sensible choice. However, Herzl was an avid supporter of the use of High German, and with him as the president, he would have implemented it as the lingua franca. Of course, there would have been a backlash by the original settlers that had devoted years of their lives to the revival of Hebrew. But I believe they would have tolerated him for some time because it was he who created the Jewish state and emancipated them from the oppressive governments in Constantinople and Europe. As time went by, the Hebrew enthusiasts would have become a niche group due to mass migration from the Russian Empire and Romania. These two countries had the worst anti-Semitic laws and frequent pogroms. The Eastern European Jews, of course, spoke varieties of Yiddish, which was intelligible with High German, so they would have welcomed rather than opposed its use as the lingua franca. Now that I have mentioned mass migration to the Jewish state, I should also mention the death of Herzl's dream of an egalitarian society where the Arabs embraced the Jews for their help in developing the land. Even since the beginning of Zionism, the local Arab population and government opposed it. In the Mutasaffarat of Jerusalem, this resulted in Jews being unable to buy more land. And later, in the British Mandate of Palestine, Arab and Jewish nationalist militias were fighting each other. It's hard to imagine this would have been any different if Jewish mass migration happened 20 years earlier. Even Herzl would not have given the Arabs equal voting power, even if that was his ideal, because of the demographic reality of Palestine at the time. In 1901, Jews made up a mere 5.9% of the population. No sane man would risk his life work for some ideological ideals. Anti-Semitism was getting worse in most of Europe, even France, where they had equal rights under the law, and many Jews were already moving from their country of birth. So I believe Jewish migration of the scale we saw after the creation of Israel in 1948 is realistic. Between 1945 and 1953, 840,000 Jews moved to Palestine and Israel. That means that Jews would surpass Arabs in Palestine within a decade from the founding of the Jewish state. Activism and violent protests will certainly occur, but the Jews can't simply expel them or oppress them, since that would inevitably anger the Ottoman government. And the other way around, the Ottoman government can't step in to protect the Arabs. Because of their weak position globally, they may have looked big on the map, but they were no match for the real great powers of the time, Britain and Germany. If the Ottomans were to step in with force and end the Jewish experiment or sanction the Jewish state, the rival of Britain would have happily provided support from their own protectorate of Egypt. Anyone would have seen this coming from a mile away. So the Germans would have surely advised the Ottomans not to do anything, and without a good motive, the British would not have tried to make the Jewish state their own protectorate, out of fear of escalating a conflict with Germany. As we can see from the Agadir crisis of 1911, Germany would not have let its rivals gain even more influence in the world. The tension between the great powers was rising quickly, and anything could have lit the fire. The Jewish state would have existed in an uneasy status quo, trying to appease all great powers at the same time. The one thing that could have ruined this balance before World War I was the Young Turk coup. The Young Turks were a pro-reform group in the Ottoman Empire. They had liberals and ethno-nationalists that were united in opposition to the absolute monarchy. But when they came to power in 1908, the group began to splinter along ideological lines, with eventually the ethno-nationalists winning out. In 1911, they started an assimilation and colonization program to disarm and Ottomanize the non-Turkish population. They were also behind the Armenian genocide and Jewish expulsions during World War I. I think it's likely they would try to dissolve the Jewish state that was still officially a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire. The Jews would have backed the British for intervention, which could have possibly brought about World War I a couple of years earlier. In 1911, Germany was a lot stronger than Russia, and overall more ready for war than the Entente, so they had a better shot at victory than in 1914. But if the Young Turks realize they are too weak for a war, the timeline doesn't change all that much from ours, and it's an Entente victory. The Jewish state would have likely been drawn into the conflict one way or another, and they would have probably gained some extra land. So here you have it, Greater Israel in 1919 and the solution to the interwar question. The Russian Revolution still happens because many of the Jewish revolutionaries were also anti-Zionists. The National Socialists still rise to power because their main point was anti-communism and ending the humiliation. It's a little bit anticlimactic, but I believe the Middle East would have been a lot less violent once the Arab countries gained independence, because the Jewish state would have been well established. So there is no equivalent of the 1948 war that started the endless cycle of conflict.